Hello everyone, I am the Enforcer, and welcome to the Breaking News. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, link in description below. Today we have absolutely breaking news coming out of the area of Eastern Europe as the Republic of Belarus has directly threatened war against the Russian Federation to supposed threats that senior members of the Russian government are attempting an annexation of the Republic. An incredibly interesting escalation to see, considering that just yesterday we had heard that Belarus was incredibly angered that they had been sidelined for BRICS membership. At the exact same time, inside the Russian Federation, we are also beginning to hear some incredibly interesting news as well, as Vladimir Putin has put out his actual peace term negotiating concessions that will be made by the Russian Federation, which are none. We've also been able to hear that there has been a very interesting piece of news from the Russian state bank, as interest rates have been hiked up another 4%, once again showing that financial troubles are starting to grip the Russian Federation quite heavily as the bank continues to try and adjust for the massive economic turmoil that is happening behind the scenes inside of the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, outside of the Russian Federation, we've also been able to hear that once again, things are getting incredibly tense within the Middle East, and United States military actions are beginning to lead us to believe that the conflict in between Israel and Iran is still coming, unlike other statements that were saying yesterday that the entire strike had been postponed indefinitely. We've been able to see that 9 American in-air tankers have been flying around the area of the Eastern Mediterranean, and we've also been able to hear from the United States Department of Defense that an incredibly large number of fighter wings from the United States Air Force have been moved immediately into the Middle East, while Iran is still stating that they are making multiple hypothetical scenarios for a counterstrike against Israel, and not only that, they have also gotten a license to produce Su-30s and Su-35s from the Russian Federation. At the exact same time, all the way across the world and inside of South Korea, we've been able to hear that today they have stated that the North Koreans are going to continue to funnel troops into Ukraine, and the initial 12,000, making up approximately a core-sized element of the North Korean armed forces, is only the beginning to the ramped up amounts of soldiers and forces that will be provided by the North Koreans as the war continues on. We have absolutely large amounts of news today coming from all over the world, and moving on into our first and most important piece of news today as far as escalations are concerned, we are seeing that the Axis powers, for the large part, are already beginning to run into some pretty considerable issues. Many of y'all will know that the Republic of Belarus is really the only ally that the Russian Federation has in the entire of Eastern Europe. The remainder of the Eastern Bloc, as well as the former Soviet Union, has either become incredibly unfriendly or untrusting of the Russian Federation, or has actually joined the Western sphere, such as the Baltic countries, Poland, the former East Germany, now a part of Germany itself, the entirety of Czechoslovakia, including the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, the entirety of Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, the list goes on and on. But nevertheless, the Belarusians have been the only one that has held out for decades at this point, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and has insisted on keeping a friendly relation to the Russian Federation, and not only that, by many in the West being called a henchman of the Russians by and large. Lukashenko has been vying recently, heavily over the past year and a half, for Belarus to finally become a BRICS member, making it BRICS. So I'm assuming that that means that BRICS would be bricked up. But nevertheless, they were benched yesterday by the Russian Federation for official BRICS membership at this point, and it does appear that Belarus is now trying to ramp up the pressure in some way, shape, or form, either to get BRICS membership or to start departing from the Russian sphere, now seeing that there is no actual hope of financial salvation or any kind of prosperity that will be coming from the Russian Federation, as Lukashenko went into this massive rant today about what has been going on with the Russians. So let me make sure that we just read this exactly word for word so that way I can get it out to y'all what Lukashenko actually said. So next, it did put out the article today saying that Lukashenko threatened Russia with war if it tries to annex Belarus. And this is exactly what Lukashenko said. Here's a direct quote from him today. "Some people in high circles of Russia are eager to annex Belarus, but the attempt to do it will turn into a war. You are smaller, we are bigger, and we have such and such an economy," whatever that means. "We will help you and further join Russia. This is not the way to ask questions. It is impossible and unrealizable. I'm even afraid to say that this is war," he added, and then also stated, "But you see, our relations with Putin, a massive negotiations, contacts, personal and otherwise, we have never had such a question. Well, there are some people in Russia and in high circles. We should throw it out. So while once again trying to salvage the statement at the end by saying, well, with Putin, we haven't really had to ask that many questions, he then doubled down and said there are still people in high circles in Russia that want to have this done, and who knows, that might start to happen soon. This is something that we have talked about a great deal here on this channel because for the past few years, the Russian Federation has made it very clear that their ambitions are not Soviet, they are imperial, at least once again trying to rekindle the glory and the grandeur of the Russian Empire at its later time of the late 19th century and up to the very early parts of the 20th century until everyone got shot and the commies took over. But nevertheless, the Belarusians were a part of the Russian Empire all the way up until the creation of the Soviet Union, and then and only then was it the first time that the Belarusians existed as an independent state, but as an independent republic inside the Soviet Union. This is something that we know the Russians do have as a plan in the future, is to eventually attempt an annexation of Belarus, because otherwise the imperial ambitions of Putin and the Russian Federation would not be realized. We have heard that Putin wants to reclaim the Baltics, parts of Poland, which were a part of Russian imperial land, along with Ukraine and Moldova. All of that combined does not create the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union actually did not control, at any point of its history, larger parts of eastern Poland. That was only the Russian Empire that controlled those areas. Even when Poland existed in its pre-1939 borders, it was actually that the Soviet Union controlled far less of this area than they did even at later points during the Cold War. So it does show us that the Russians would have a plan to try and attempt to annex Belarus, and it appears that Lukashenko may be wising up to that, considering that their BRICS membership was just shelved most likely indefinitely yesterday, along with the Republic of Turkey, which was also attempting to join BRICS simultaneously. Meanwhile, it seems as though the Russian Federation is trying to bring an end to the Ukraine war once and for all. We actually heard that yesterday during the BRICS summit in Kazan that Vladimir Putin stated that he would actually like to bring forward real peace talks, long-lasting peace talks, about what will be happening in the Ukraine war and what will be going on largely as a result of these peace talks. The kind of terms, the kind of concessions that both sides would give. Because obviously, peace terms can only go forward if both sides are truly unhappy, if both sides are making compromises to where they understand that we may not get exactly everything that we want, but at least we'll get some of it, and that was worth it in the long run. And so Putin today has now clarified his statements and has said in such a heroic and noble statement that the Russians will give no concessions at all and the Ukrainians can burn in hell. That's pretty much exactly what he said. You can actually see the clip of him saying it right here, which I will show you. Unfortunately, we don't have an English translation for it, but if you can speak or understand Russian, which I cannot, you will hear him say that statement here in this clip.
Исход должен быть в пользу России, я говорю прямо, без всякого стеснения, и должен исходить из тех реалий, которые складываются.
Suffice it to say, the entire thing about wanting to turn a new leaf and have peace was an absolute lie, because there will be no concessions or compromises on Ukraine, according to Putin, and any outcomes must favor Russia. Based on the realities on the battlefield, we're not considering any concessions or trades, meaning that this attempt at peace was a complete flop from the beginning. It was not actually meant to try and actually achieve a peace, and therefore the war will continue on as normal. The war in Ukraine will not be ending anytime soon, and it appears that the Russian Federation just did another bait and switch on everyone in the world, including everyone in the pro-Ukraine sphere that was thinking that maybe this time they would actually seriously consider peace. Although I think that camp of people was like three large. It wasn't really even a big group, because I don't think anyone believed Putin from the outset when this peace proposal was made yesterday. Nevertheless, it does seem as though the Russian Federation is going to war with its financial sector, as the country is still running deeper and deeper into financial ruin. And the Russian central bank, as of today, has raised its interest rate from 19% to 21%, a record for the past 20 years. It appears that the Russian Federation is doing horrendously right now financially, and we have seen that as the years have passed in the war, the interest rates have been hiked up higher and higher, and more companies have filed for bankruptcy or have completely collapsed under the major economic strain that is currently plaguing the country. We are understanding that the Russian Federation is still attempting to cook the books and at least try and keep the financial situation somewhat stable inside of Russia, but it is a very fragile economic system that is prone to collapse at just about any moment. Just a simple calamity that would seem to be fairly mundane or cause a little bit of a tremor could completely bring the Russian economic system down to its knees. it seems as though they are slightly insulated by that at this point, because the largest and most impactful kind of sanctions have been made at this point by the Western world, meaning that no larger tremors or just explosions could happen inside the Russian economy. But nevertheless, it is still a very fragile situation, and we will be trying to see and gauge out what is going to be happening with the Russian Federation going on from this point. Nevertheless, it seems as though the Russians are trying to find fallbacks, and one of the fallbacks that the Russians love are nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are just a be-all, end-all, and it largely starts to freeze everything exactly where it is. Otherwise, you're scaring people with getting obliterated in nuclear hellfire. But the Russians have decided that they might want to become a little bit more creative with these threats. You know, nuclear hellfire, it only sells for a couple of years, and then once you keep throwing that threat out, everyone generally stops believing in it. So the Russians appear, according to US satellite intelligence, to be setting up a brand new bioweapons factory right outside of Moscow in its southwestern district. According to the satellite pictures we have, they are restoring an old laboratory that was actually used during the Cold War to produce biological weapons for the Soviet Union. We can actually see some pictures of this right here from satellite footage, once again showing us that the building is being rebuilt at its former compound. You can actually see the construction site right there, and this is within the northwestern area of Moscow. We are assuming that the Russians may be attempting to kickstart another biological weapons program to try and give themselves a little bit more of a cutting edge, at least compared to the West, so that way they're not only relying on nuclear threats, they also have biological weapons that they could fall back on as well. Those are a complete violation of the Geneva Convention, of course, but it never seems as though the Russians have really cared about that over the entirety of this war. Nevertheless, moving on from that and down into the Middle East, we have been able to see that today things are still leading us to believe that the Israeli strike is going to be coming around very soon. We have seen that both sides, not Israel directly, but the United States and Iran, are still making actions and preparations for the Israeli strike that is to come. This is largely disproving the statements that came out yesterday that were claiming that the Israeli strike has been postponed indefinitely, because if it was, we would actually see that tensions in the region would largely be subsiding at this point and would once again completely focus back on the regional war happening in between Israel and Lebanon as Israel tries to fight the Iranian proxies inside the country. However, no one is showing that that is actually the case. We're actually seeing that more U.S. forces are being brought into the area, along with the Iranians now preparing, according to their own government statements, hypothetical scenarios for the different kinds of Israeli strikes that are to come and what they'll be doing as a response to those strikes. The most important news that we did get today out of the Eastern Mediterranean was that there was an incredibly large presence of in-air tankers from the United States Air Force, or as they're called, aerial refueling tankers, that were in this area. According to information that we have, there was 5 KC-135s and 4 KC-46s that were flying over the Eastern Mediterranean today, usually flying in some sort of an orbit or some sort of a pattern over the area, highly suggesting that they were conducting in-air refueling operations on aircraft that did not have their transponders on and were not showing up on flight radar. This would be heavily suggesting that the United States Air Force, or the United States Air Forces, if we want to call it that, either the Marines or the Navy, were transporting a large number of aircraft over the Eastern Mediterranean and on into the Middle East, as obviously you would not need in-air refueling tankers for aircraft that are operating in Europe in the Eastern Mediterranean. We've only seen in-air refueling tankers over the entirety of the past year and a half in this area when the United States is moving new aircraft into the Middle East. And we did get a statement right afterwards from the United States Department of Defense confirming that there was a large amount of aircraft from multiple different fighter wings that have been moved into the Middle East today. According to the information that we have, the mystery of today's tanker activity over the Mediterranean was solved as the U.S. Central Command announced the arrival of F-16CJs with the 480th Fighter Squadron from Spangdahelm, and I'm mispronouncing that massively, in Germany to Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. The F-16CJs and the 480th specialize in the suppression of enemy air defense, or SEAD operations, which are largely targeting enemy radar installations and destroying them, pretty much wiping out the eyes of any air defense systems that would be operational in the area. Interestingly enough, the actual capabilities of this air squadron is a very interesting one, and largely would be showing that this air squadron, if conducting any action, would actually be conducting offensive action against the Islamic Republic of Iran. SEAD operations are a very specific form of a mission for a air wing or a squadron to specialize in. SEAD operations, like I was explaining a moment ago, largely focus on the destruction of enemy radar sites, which completely block out the ability for the Islamic Republic of Iran to be able to locate enemy aircraft and target and fire at them with their ground air defense systems. With the fact that this is being moved into Saudi Arabia specifically, it may be showing that the United States is preparing for a possible preemptive strike or or some sort of an offensive counterstrike to the Islamic Republic of Iran if their attack is to expand outside of Israel. We've also heard that there's a pretty interesting thing that did happen today diplomatically. It didn't make it onto our news bulletin, but we did hear that the United States has assured Saudi Arabia security for the near future, meaning that if the Saudi Arabians were ever attacked by Iran, we would be there in their defense and maybe even conduct offensive action in support of their security interests. This is a fairly interesting thing, once again showing that Seed aircraft are being moved into the area, as this may be showing that if Saudi Arabia did end up coming under attack, the United States would respond with an attack on Iran, destroying their radar installations and sites with the Seed missions, and then carrying through with larger amounts of air activity, considering that air superiority would largely be leaning in America's favor by that point. Of course, this is all entirely a hypothetical. It is very interesting, though, to see that a specific air squadron would be brought in that specializes in Seed operations, which is largely an offensive action, but we'll be waiting to see how that actually transpires, and if we get any additional information on what the actual purpose of this air squadron being in Saudi Arabia actually is. Moving on from that and into Iran, however, on the other side of the coin, we are seeing that the Iranians are still forming military plans for the upcoming Israeli strike. It doesn't seem that the Iranians are believing that the Israeli strike has been postponed indefinitely, as Iranian officials did tell the New York Times today that the Supreme Leader Khomeini has ordered the military to develop multiple military plans for responding to an Israeli attack. And also at the same time, we have also heard that the Russian Federation, most likely in an attempt to maybe prepare them in a long-term sort of a conflict against Israel, has now given them the license to produce Su-30 and Su-35 fighters. These have not really been that good in Ukraine. We've actually seen a good amount of them get shot down, and they seem to be largely inadequate. They're a fourth generation fighter, but really technologically, from what we can tell, based off the computer systems and avionics, they hardly are fourth generation fighters or fourth generation plus fighters. They really are all almost just third generation plus with a fourth generation airframe, from what we can tell. Nevertheless, these aircraft are now going to be approved for licensed production inside of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and if somehow Iran can actually get an aviation industry, which they've never had, they will be able to produce these aircraft in larger numbers. Problem is, they don't have an aviation industry. They are still using F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms from the 1960s and 70s, which was the last time we sold them aircraft before they had a coup that turned Persia into the Islamic Republic that we see today. So to be entirely honest with y'all, I don't think the license actually means anything, rather than to be a license to be an idiot. If they ever built one of these things, it would probably be incredibly unsound. It will most likely crash and burn, because they don't even have any kind of advanced machining components to produce any kind of aviation systems, equipment, or parts that would be reliable. They've never been able to do that. That's why their Air Force is continuously shrinking over the years, is because every single time one of their older aircraft breaks down, they literally don't even have the ability to fabricate parts that were made in the 60s and 70s. So I'm not expecting that they're ever going to be able to produce these aircraft in larger numbers. They will most likely entirely be reliant on the Russian Federation to purchase and then ship freshly made Su-30s and Su-35s straight off the assembly line and to Iran. Moving on from that, however, and into South Korea, we are hearing that the South Korean and North Korean tensions are still fairly high. We have not heard of any actual updates of actions made by South and North Korea towards each other today, but we did get to hear that the South Koreans did make a statement that according to their intelligence, and this was stated by Yonhap News today, which is largely the #1 news source out of South Korea, and this was once again corroborated by Bloomberg, that apparently more North Korean soldiers will be sent to Russia. The initial 12,000, which we believe is somewhere around a core-sized element, although it's incredibly bizarre how the North Koreans' actual, I guess you could say, force structure works. Instead of it being off of a largely westernized system in the modern day, where you have the army, which is then broken up into brigades, and the brigades are broken up into battalions, the North Koreans actually operate off of a core system that is largely a holdover from the Soviet Union's time back in the Cold War. So instead of them having an actual comparable kind of a unit to a brigade combat team in the U.S. Army, or a Marine Expeditionary Unit, or for that example, a Chinese Combined Arms Brigade inside of the People's Liberation Army, this is how the North Korean system works. So instead of it having orders issued from the Army down to the brigade and then down to the battalions and then back up, the North Korean system works off of a corps, meaning that the corps issues orders to their divisions. The divisions then issue their order to the brigades. The brigades then issue their orders, believe it or not, shockingly enough, not to the battalions, but straight to the regiments. And then from the regiments, the orders are issued down to the battalions. The actual basic fighting element of the Korean People's Army is not a battalion like it would be here in the United States or in China or even in Russia. They actually work at their basic fighting level element at the regiment, which is insane because that means that you have multiple battalions which are all tied together and linked into one massive unit that is completely inflexible to actual more minute or rapid changes on the battlefield, meaning that North Korea's command structure is wildly inflexible and most likely will not be able to handle the kind of pressures that are going on currently inside the Kursk Oblast or even be able to account for them and react to them quickly. We just don't think they'll ever have the ability to do that, and that does mean that there will be a high amount of losses sustained by the North Koreans as we watch them engage the Ukrainians here over these next few weeks. This also means that to keep these number of forces inside of Russia at a similar size to what they originally arrived in, they will have to continually keep a flow of North Koreans moving into Russia. For this reason, we do know that there will be a steady flow of North Koreans, but at the same time, it also seems that the South Koreans are stating that there may just be even additional amounts of forces that are moved in, augmenting the original number at 12,000 and maybe even moving it up to be an entire additional corps that is inside of Ukraine, or maybe even a higher amount than that. We're not entirely sure at the moment, but South Korean intelligence documents did provide details on the scale of arms shipments that are being sent from North Korea to Russia. And North Korea has shockingly enough sent about 8 million 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter shells, an insanely high amount. We have seen that on average the Russians consume around 50,000 shells per month. With 8 million shells being provided by the North Koreans, the Russians are not only keeping up with the amount of ammunition usage occurring on a daily basis, they're actually building up their ammunition stores over time. The Ukrainians, of course, greatly relegated that, though, by blowing up some of their mega ammo depots over the past few months, but nevertheless, it is still largely on an uptick. They've also sent about 100 Hwasong 11s and some Bolsay 4 anti-tank weapons. We've never seen the Bolsay in use before, so we don't even know what the hell those things are or what they're going to be doing against Ukrainian forces, but nevertheless, it does seem as though a decent amount of arms shipments are still being conducted by the North Koreans, and not only that, South Korea is expecting that the number of North Korean forces in Ukraine will continue to grow. We do know that South Korea and Poland are working together through Hyundai Rotem to start a mass production of K2 Black Panthers along with R6000 Rhinos inside of Poland to continuously keep at least a significant number of tanks and APCs flowing into the Ukrainian armed forces and helping them to at least maintain their force size or account for losses or maybe even raise brand new brigades using largely westernized military equipment. Moving on from that, though, and into the Kursk Oblast, we did get to hear that today Oleksandr Syrsky has given a general statement, according to the Ukrainian armed forces, of the Russian losses inside of the area. I do want to once again keep in mind for everyone that's listening to this, these numbers may be skewed. Largely, we have seen that the Russians have well overinflated the amount of Ukrainian losses that they've ever inflicted in the war, and while we generally believe here on this channel at face value Ukrainian casualty reports, I would want y'all to keep in mind that there may be a little bit of fudging to these numbers, and all of these numbers may just be a slight percentage higher than they actually are in real life if we were to actually see the unclassified raw numbers that the Ukrainians have understood. But nevertheless, there are 17,819 personnel in the armed forces of the Russian Federation that have apparently been largely put out of action by the Ukrainians in the Kursk Oblast. A brigade-sized element is usually around 3,000 to 5,000 strong, so if you do the math on the high numbers, this is at least 3 entire brigades of Russian armed forces that have been knocked out from largely the fighting just in the Kursk Oblast alone over really the past 3 months. Out of that, 6,662 Russians have been straight up killed, at least according to Oleksandr Syrsky. Another 10,500 of them have been wounded, and the Ukrainians have taken 711 prisoners. And we do know that the prisoner number is exactly accurate. We were here to document that here on the channel when each prisoner was taken, and our number is somewhere in the low 700s, so that number is largely dead on. Nevertheless, the Russians have also lost a considerable amount of equipment as well. 45 tanks, equivalent to about 5 battalion tactical groups of the Russian armed forces that have been lost in just raw tank numbers. We've also seen that 256 APCs have also been lost as well within the Kursk Oblast, along with 565 units of automotive equipment, meaning Ladas, 99 artillery systems. Ukrainian counter battery has been fairly good considering the lack of Russian artillery that's in this area. That's actually a fairly high number if we were to take that at face value. And then 5 MLRSs. MLRSs have been used a lot less at this point in the war than before, so these numbers are expected to be quite low. Even the Ukrainian number, if this is being fudged slightly, is quite low compared to what we used to see at the beginning of the war. Nevertheless, the losses, according to the Ukrainians, are pretty significant, and it is showing that they're not making a lot of ground progress in Kursk, but they certainly are tying up a lot of Russian manpower and expending a lot of Russian manpower and resources because the Russians are continuously having to try and contain the Ukrainian offensive inside the Kursk Oblast, which largely is a fairly good benefit for Ukraine, as this is drawing a lot of Russian offensive efforts away from pretty precarious areas like Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar, and moving instead into the Russian Federation itself, largely alleviating the frontline pressures that are seen inside of Ukraine at the moment. But nevertheless, that is all of the breaking news that we have today. I've got to thank each and every one of y'all so much once again for watching. If y'all have enjoyed, please make sure to subscribe. I say this every day, and it's true every single day. YouTube literally does not care how many subscribers we have at this point. YouTube completely knocked that out of the algorithm, so if you ever hear anyone saying subscribe, it helps my channel. It literally does not. The only reason we like to see people subscribe is because it lets us know that y'all really do enjoy the work that we're putting out, and it makes us incredibly happy to see that folks do want to hear from us more and want to hear more news from this channel specifically. And we pretty much put out short war videos every single day that there is enough news to cover at this point of the day. We also run live streams at night as well at 10 p.m. Eastern time, so if you're new to the channel and you want to hear a really, really long and drawn out explanation of what happened and literally every single detail that we can find over the course of the day, you can go to the stream at 10 p.m. Eastern time and check that out. We usually joke around a lot in that too. Some people like that, some people don't. So whatever's your taste, either the short war videos or the streams, we have both of them. Also, if y'all do want to hit the like button, we love to see when people hit the like button on these videos. And also, one other thing, if you have made it to this point in the video, which is, I would assume, at least like 20 minutes in at this point or something like that, it's got to be pretty long. If you have made it to this point of the video, please make sure to go down into the comments section and put FANK, spelled F-A-N-K, in the comments section. Just go down there and type FANK, that is F-A-N-K, into the comments section to let me know that you made it all the way to the end of the video. It is great to know that y'all all were watching today, and of course, I will see you tonight on the live stream at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you on the next one. Take care, and long live the Lee Spring Army.